Welcome to the March Parent seminar. It's great to have you all here. And today we will hear from Aris Trantidis. Aris has been joining us for a while on the calls, and he's currently visiting lecturer and teaching fellow at King's College London, and also a postdoctoral fellow at George Mason. And he has a book that came out in 2016, Clientelism and Economic Policy. In Greece, so focusing on Greece. And this paper today will also speak to the role clientelism might play in a democratic decline. So thank you for joining us, Aris, and the screen is yours. So yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm going to share my screen with you. Well, we're a small crowd, but that means that we can have a deeper conversation about this. Let me go to my, can you see my screen?
Not yet, no.
Not yet, so I have to try again. So share screen. All right. What about now?
Yes.
Now I got it.
Fantastic. Yep. Okay, right. Let me go to the PowerPoint presentation and start the typical stuff, which is somewhere here. All right, okay. Well, we are talking about the title is State-Sponsored Capitalism, the Future of Liberal Democracy. And well, about 30 years ago, the optimism in the air was epitomized in Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. It was expected that the world is going to gravitate around liberal democracy. Those ideas have won the battle of ideas and the battle of real politics. And this is, they have a gravitational force. Societies would want to be like a liberal democracy with the rule of law and possibly in a welfare state with general rules, a mixed economy, the kind of politics that we had in Western Europe, in Northern Europe, and the United States. However, instead of this optimism, we ended up with those kinds of books, How Democracies Die, Fascism, A Warning by Madeleine Albright, and On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder, is just a small sample from a collection of books that described and expressed the skepticism that prevailed, particularly after Donald Trump's victory in 2016, that is not democracy, it's not democracy that expanding, but we are going to experience a third wave of authoritarianism, that authoritarianism is closing in, and that increased polarization, populists getting power while having a toxic agenda that defies the rule of law, that attacks checks and balances, that stirs the worst emotions in people. These are the conditions that existed in the past in cases where democratic institutions collapsed and we had a slide into authoritarianism. Now, we've seen that there is a third wave of authoritarianism, but it doesn't concern so far what we call consolidated democracies. We have the rise of what we call hybrid regimes or semi-authoritarian regimes, which there is always a leader or a dominant party that runs the political system with elections, yet it always gets, or he or the party gets, an overwhelming majority. And those systems are electoral systems, but they're characterized by the weakening of political opposition without destroying the formal operation of what remains as a nominal democracy. And there are mechanisms behind that. Somehow those regimes manage to manipulate electoral preferences, and they use elections to legitimize themselves through democratic procedures. Now, how far the country has gone along the continuum of semi-authoritarianism, flawed democracies, all the way to outright authoritarianism varies. So in this picture, you're seeing Putin and Lukashenko, apparently authoritarian leaders in the kind of regimes that we describe as electoral authoritarianism, as opposed to more open systems, such as in Hungary, when the process is supposed to be starting, and we're not sure how far it's going to go. And Turkey stands in between. There is competition, there is a degree of contestation, but it is under the dominant presence of President Erdogan. So we remain with the question that whether this is possible to see this pathway in advanced liberal democracies, and how is it possible given the fact that all these warnings that we had, that the United States is going down the path because Trump and populist Brexit here in England, they're taking power with this toxic message. And it hasn't happened. We've seen that democracies show what I call a strong immune system, democratic immunity or democratic resilience, because consolidated democracies are built up by a landscape of socioeconomic pluralism. There are cleavages and policy divisions that a single leader cannot satisfy simultaneously. There are differences of opinion, of social status, and as the result, whoever comes in power faces policy-generated dissent. And on top of that, there are checks and balances, an independent judiciary, constitutional control of the administration and the legislation, and in a way, multiple political networks, even within the main parties, competing for access to power. So there is strong opposition, and the process of autocratization seems to be a Herculean task. We're talking about diminishing socioeconomic pluralism to the degree that a single organization, a single party will be able to accommodate conflicting and competing demands. It takes an erosion of checks and balances that is unprecedented historically, and a party that is very centralized as well, dealing with its own defections and factionalisms within, as well as a very weak opposition. We haven't seen that in the United States. We haven't seen that in many European countries that experience populism, authoritarian populism, the rise of far-right parties, which suggests that our systems are quite healthy. And the fear of polarization is not a substantial ground to envisage an authoritarian turn. So my question is, how can it happen? Can it happen? My answer is yes, nonetheless. It can happen through a structural shift in the economy. This is where the concept of state-sponsored capitalism comes in, and I'm going to explain later on what I mean by that. But I'm going to show now how this form of capitalism undermines the strength of socioeconomic pluralism, erodes checks and balances, changes the nature of political networking with the creation of star-shaped hierarchies that change the landscape and make a change from an open field to a field that is skewed to support the hegemony, the dominance of a single organization in charge of that system. So this project is a book, essentially. It's not an article. What you're reading is just a summary of a book project and years of my research that's supposed to be kind of non-ideal political theory, but heavily influenced by observations in Belarus, in Russia, and in other places. I have a few slides. If I have enough time, I'm going to go over a few more slides. And if you're interested, you can read some of my work that was published earlier on. In that work, I define democracy, which is the ideal demos in control of Kratos, very realistically. I accept that the reality of politics, that there are asymmetrical resources, and there's always a risk of domination. Actually, democracy is a system designed from the perspective of citizens to protect themselves against domination, rather than to upload their preferences and somehow miraculously influence politics. It's a very defensive system. And it's characterized by competition for access to political power, because political power distributes resources, as well as competition over influence to those who have access to the political power through lobbying, through protest, through acts of contestation. And in that system, the citizens emerge themselves more empowered, not as individual voters, but because they participate in forms of collective action, because they're members of a professional organization with some bargaining power, because they're members of a political party with a stronger cohesion to make collective demands and overcome the collective action problem. The collective action is essentially society's defense against nomination. And this gives rise to what I call the network pluralism, which is the structure of political liberty. It's a society that the vision of pluralism as networked is that society consists of multiple large world networks of interactions and clusters of small world networks, such as family associations, etc. So it's not just the relationship between the anonymous relationship between consumers or voters. There are small world networks in which there are small, short connections. And these are central clusters that exist and interact with one another as such. Now, there are central nodes, and that superimpose upon this large network those small world networks, labor unions, professional organizations, church organizations. There are multiple forms of networking, of course, and not just one single way structure of networks. But the most important force is the government. The government has a star-shaped relationship to us, the citizens, and organizations and firms, because it sends commands directly. Okay, what the government asks us to do, if it's legitimate, we have to do it. But this is one form of networking that overlaps with other forms that interact and create what I call a structure of network pluralism that is very dynamic. This is a snapshot, for instance, and of how this network is. So when you see the big nodes, those nodes can be, for instance, media outlets projecting information to the viewers. But if you are, if you're following the green TV channel, you can always switch to the red TV channel. There can be other small spheres of employment that may act as small authority areas where you have to be pleasant with your boss, you have to accept the ethos of the organization. But what you have is the possibility of exit, okay? You can change your network connection, the edge that you have, by switching sides. And that is what creates a scope for a room for maneuver for us individuals. Society, as I said in the third point, is not reduced to a single star-shaped network commanded by the government. And on top of that, the government itself is a small network. The checks and balances, the division of power is an example that nobody essentially controls the whole system. The president is not the omnipotent dictator. Most of people here, you are from America, you're familiar with the structure. So I'm not going to stay that much on that slide. Now, moving from understanding democracy as network pluralism with a room for exit and a room for voice through collective action, we come to the nature of politics as a competition also for acquiring privilege. And I define privilege as a set of properties a group or a person can enjoy that gives them advantage in terms of access to political decision-making compared to what the formal structure of representation offers to all citizens. So people who are closer to the government and they find a way to influence politics and policy making are more privileged. So to be more specific, lobbyists, organized special interests are in a position to bargain and acquire political privilege, and they can enjoy political privilege by virtue of the resources that they can mobilize and all institutional advantages because they're close to power or they have been included in consultation processes. And these elite groups are small groups, okay, small world networks that are clustered around the key decision-making nodes within a political system. Now, how state-sponsored capitalism changes that? Well, I define state-sponsored capitalism, first of all, as a system in which the benefits that the government distributes go to beneficiaries that can be identifiable. So it's not state capitalism or the mixed economy. It's part of particularistic politics with allocations that have a higher degree of disintegration and differentiation, so beneficiaries can be identified as firms or specific individuals. And those benefits, of course, are a form of privilege. So in case of the welfare state, having access to a hospital, for instance, or having access to primary education is not in this sense, in that narrow sense, a privilege, because the beneficiaries are an indefinite number of people who access those state provisions impersonally, without necessarily being identified as beneficiaries by the agencies that distribute those resources. So it's essentially the distribution of private goods in the broader sense, or club goods for a particular group, meaning that they're excludable and rivalrous. So we're not talking about public goods in the economic sense or public goods in the broader sense, which can be private goods offered to everybody, such as access to healthcare, when healthcare moves from the private sector to the public sector. They are the equivalent of private goods that are excludable and rivalrous in the form of a privilege. The beneficiary can be identified. Therefore, the beneficiary is essentially sponsored in that sense. That's why I'm using the term sponsorship. And that creates competition for access to state sponsorship. And as I said in the next slide, state sponsorship favors favors clientelism. And the most important part, in the first bullet point, it imposes a star-shaped network of allocations connecting the government as a central node to identifiable recipients. Okay, so it's another superimposed network structure, which is star-shaped. So it's quite hierarchical and prone to control. Now, one possibility out of that is that the state that does that, the state that sponsors, is captured. You hear that particularly from the political left, but also in public choice theory, that lobbying and special interests gain access because they are closer to power. They lobby and they capture the decision-making process. And as the result, there is an economic oligarchy, and there is also a dominant network of the rent seekers who are able to get those privileges by capturing the state. But the state here is presented as hollow, as open to capture, lacking the agency and the political leadership to play a role in that process. More likely, in my view, is the second possibility, that the state is capturing rather than being captured. It is used by the leader and the organization that controls the state mechanism, controls the government, to capture in the form of a star-shaped network those actors who compete for that privilege. And this is where the analysis comes, where I'm leading this form of structure to hegemony, to the idea that there is a dominant leader organization that manages to erode socioeconomic pluralism, erode checks and balances, and bring a degree of centralization of political control that weakens the opposition, whether this is, we refer to parties or whether we refer to civil society organizations and other groups that form part of what I described earlier as democratic resilience, the immune system of democracy. So as I said, the first and the second scenario is more possible because state sponsorship is prone to clientelism. Now, in my book, Clientelism in Economic Policy, I define clientelism both in the traditional sense, the distribution where there is an explicit exchange with the terms of agreement read as in this quote by Stokes, the criterion distribution that the patron uses is, will you support me? So if there is an explicit agreement that you're going to offer something back in the form of political support, your money, your time, your donations, your loyalty. But in several other articles, such as this one in the Journal of European Public Policy, I talked about the aggregate level, the network level of this practice that doesn't affect individual networks, but it is a form of a clientelist machine that changes the nature of the political party, making it a network of rent-extracting actors. And parties can be brokers of special interest, but the parties have their own hierarchy, and that hierarchy affects the way those rent-extracting actors behave, how they access those clientelist benefits. So the clientelist network is more likely to resemble, again, a star-shaped network with key brokers and other beneficiaries. It is a prevalent mode of interest accommodation. The more activities in the economy become state-sponsored through subsidies, through public procurement, infrastructure projects, protectionism, tariffs, all the policies that can identify the beneficiary, the more prevalent it becomes as a mode of interest accommodation in politics and society. But it's also a method of political mobilization, offers a solution to a collective action problem, because the behavior can be monitored. Beneficiaries are identifiable, and their behavior, their loyalty, their allegiance can be monitored. It's a strategy of party organization, creating loyal and animated political support groups. Actually, it's a superior strategy to ideology, because with ideology, I may agree with you, but doesn't mean that I'm going to devote a lot of time of my work, to support you. But if my own professional career, my own business success depends on your support, then it makes sense. It is rational to devote time and to be a loyal and animated political supporter. And those clientelist groups are privileged groups in return for their loyalty and complacency. Now, what is the direct and indirect effect of clientelism and party competition? Most of the literature suggests that clientelism is vote buying, and they have examples from Latin America. You pay and $20 and you get the vote, or this is not how clientelism works, because if those goods are excludable and rivalrous, they cannot be offered to everybody. But indirectly, clientelism, those rewards are offered to those who can bid and offer the greatest level of support, depending on the circumstances. That can be a big donation, or it can be a labor union, already an organization whose loyalty can shift, and it can be, of course, very active, animated supporters that are very valuable as part of a political party's campaign. And because those ones become loyal to the organization that distributes those benefits, they go out and they appeal to the voters. They're the ones who carry the message and make your message visible, that make the party look like a strong party with a strong voice. Because no matter what great idea you have, no matter how wonderful a politician you may be, if you're not visible, if you don't have campaign resources, you cannot appeal to the broader public. So the question here is that a clientelist organization should co-opt the central nodes of the system, not everybody, through clientelistic change, the media owners, the big business, the labor unions, the labor leaders, essentially, creating strong star-shaped connectivities with those key agents and organizations that are supposed to be acting as civil society organizations that usually in network pluralism have opposing positions and build up a competitive arena. So with the government now as a central node, you have the centralization of the star-shaped system that controls behavior. And even if the government may dissatisfy somebody within that network, there's no scope for exit. Where are you going to go if the economy has become predominantly state-sponsored? So you stay there and you stomach it, expecting that you're going to be dealt better in a better way later on. I will finish with some historical evidence. Where does this come from? It comes from the observation of autocratization efforts in Slovakia and Belarus, and in the 1990s, and why Belarus under Lukashenko developed into a political hegemony where Slovakia didn't. And the difference that I identified is that Slovakia had a very strong civil society whose sources were found in economic activities outside the reach of the state, whereas Belarus had a predominantly state-sponsored economy. And you can read more about that in the recent paper in the British Journal of Politics and IR, Building an Authoritarian Regime, Strategies for Autocratization and Resistance in Belarus and Slovakia, and the more theoretical exposition of some of that analysis in an older paper, Clientelism and the Classification of Dominant Party Systems. The title is not very explicit, but essentially it discusses how hegemony is possible in an electoral system, given the prevalence of socioeconomic diversity that creates centrifugal tendencies, that creates contestation. And the idea is that this can be done by clientelism when it reaches an extent in which social actors do not have a scope for exit and therefore adjust their own voice, adjust their own preference expressions accordingly. Finally, another article that you may consider is Hayek versus Trump. So all these bits and pieces help articulate this central argument that I present with this summary paper. When we make a differentiation between welfare state, together with Nick Cowan, my colleague at the University of Lincoln, we make a differentiation between partial discriminatory allocations that can be prone to clientelism, and that's a new way of bringing serfdom, not in a planned economy, but in an economy that's supposed to be a market economy under state sponsorship, as opposed to welfare state provisions that are less likely to be personal and discriminatory, more likely to be impersonal and open access. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Very timely paper. So I see Roger already has his hand up. So yeah, let's start with you, Roger.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, I totally agree, Aris, that this idea of clientelism and I guess related, oops, I don't have my video. Clientelism and related ideas is very important in this story, and it's kind of a threat to, democratic pluralism. So that's an important principle. You mentioned, I had a lot of questions and comments, but I want to first, as a, I guess like a preliminary thing. I mean, you mentioned Brexiteers, but I don't think I understood how how you were modeling them and how they fit into your story.
Okay, that's a single question. They don't fit in my story. They fit in the story of those who argue that populist far-right politics pose a danger to liberal democracy because they stir nationalist sentiments. They stir a climate that is polarizing in a society. That was part of a kind of a scholarly reaction to the rise of Trump and the rise of the far right, the rise of nationalism in Europe. What I'm saying is that this is not relevant, actually, that those events that raise polarization, such as Brexit or any other referendum, including the presence of the far right, what they do is they show how democracy has its own immune system and defends itself, and how polarization actually is a healthy sign of democracy. The fact that we, in the United States, we can debate and we can criticize openly Trump and now socially and politically ostracize them as the reaction to what he was doing, whether we like it or not, is a sign that polarization and the toxicity that comes from polarization is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily lead to democratic backsliding. On the contrary, civil society organizations, political parties are activated as an immune system to protect and restore democracy and contestability. My argument is contestability.
So you use the word restore democracy. So you're accepting the view of people who point to Brexit, that the Brexiteers are fundamentally anti-democratic. You're sort of saying that, but then you're saying, well, but look how robust democracy is.
No, I didn't say that. I said that Brexit was seen by certain scholars, and I showed you some books in the beginning, as a sign of polarization that can potentially undermine democracy by inciting political passions. And those passions can be exploited by political leaders. Once they go out of control, a political leader can come and say, I'm going to bring stability, but I need extra powers to do so. This is the argument developed by Levitsky and Ziblatt, which I describe in my book, their book. I describe it in my paper. The mechanism is derived from what happened in Nazi Germany. So I'm never going to say that Brexit is directly linked to authoritarianism. I'm saying that all those incidents that we have recently, Trump, Brexit, far-right politics, the COVID-19 crisis, movements that have been accused of being authoritarian because they oppose the lockdowns. The dominant discourse that I'm arguing against is that those acts of political contestation are somehow threatening democracy. What I'm saying is that the more contestation you have, the healthier the democracy becomes.
Sorry. Now I'm with you. Thank you for carrying me all the way there.
Yeah, I actually benefited from that explanation too. That was very helpful. Thank you, Aris. I'm gonna think more about my question. Cameron, how about we move to you?
All right, so I really like what you're doing here. I like the idea of clientelism as contrasted to the usual public choice conception of political bargaining, and especially of clientelism as a collective action strategy. And I've actually been trying over the past few years to advance clientelism also as the most useful category for describing how well-governed societies can then fail to be well-governed. But your examples, it seems like you have in mind a lot of right-wing populism, which it's fine. It probably is well described by populism. But it seems like, at least in the US, there's a huge amount of populism or a huge amount of clientelism on all sides of the populist coin. And I think this, I would use this to cast doubt on your conception of the immune system or its contestation as the immune system. So for example, at the end of your paper, you talk about the welfare state as a kind of a poor vehicle for clientelistic benefits, and then talk about some things that could happen, which are happening, right? I mean, you see a lot of a lot of popular discourse now talking about we need to take account of race in distributing, for example, medical care. Several states did this for COVID vaccines. We need to take account of race for college admissions, for hiring and promotion and things like this. And so I do think that your account of clientelism is maybe overly focused on individual clients rather than client groups. Because one thing that comes out of, for example, North Wallace and Weingast, or for example, Johnson and Koyama's new book, is that pre-modern governance is always done through client groups more than client individuals. And it seems like that's what a lot of, for example, when people talk about structural, the word structural in modern discourse, what this does is it tells us to look behind the veil of ignorance, so to speak, the Rawls's veil of ignorance, and say, we have these general rules, but who do they actually benefit, right? So we're looking behind the veil of ignorance, instituting these general rules, supposedly general rules, knowing that they will benefit certain client groups. And that's where it seems like all the intellectual energy is in legitimizing this kind of backdoor clientelism, knowing that we can now peer behind this veil of ignorance. So I guess that's my question.
Yeah, that's a very good question for me to clarify that. You're absolutely right. Essentially, maybe there are two questions. One concerns whether the right wing, whether clientelism and authoritarianism is the exclusive kind of strategy from far right or wannabe autocrats or not. I think one misunderstanding is possibly because Nick Cowan and I published Hayek versus Trump, the radical right's move to road to serfdom, emphasizing the perils of protectionism, because that was the dominant economic discourse. It didn't actually materialize. Donald Trump was very mildly changing the status quo, but back then he was using the language of America first and protectionism, and we use that practice in which beneficiaries are identified. Okay, the firms, the particular firms, not the individuals, but the firms as well. The organizations, the labor unions that profit from that are identifiable, and they can be given those benefits not as private goods, but as club goods. I stressed that in my presentation, that the exclusivity and of clientelist benefits applies at the club level, club goods that concern an organization, for instance, or a labor association. But it's not only a case that only Trump and the radical right sponsors the idea of protectionism, in which beneficiaries can be identified and loyalty can be elicited as a reciprocation for whatever benefit they get for as long as they get it. It is something that concerns all political parties across the ideological and political spectrum, particularly because each of those ideologies emphasize a particular aspect of state sponsorship. So part of the far right is protectionism, economic protectionism, but there is a lot of economic protectionism from the left as well. So it's definitely not the case that I'm saying it's just a problem from the radical left. Actually, it's the problem across the political spectrum, because those ideas, the ideas of state sponsorship, are being promoted. They're being promoted in academia as well. How money can be used by the state, generating that money, think of modern monetary theory, and then the state has a free rein to create infrastructure in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. The kind of central banking in America and in Europe, in which there's more money available for the governments to pick up national champions. That is not just right-wing politics. It is politics today. So the second point about individuals, I emphasize groups, and you may see those nodes in that network, but those nodes can be clusters of individuals, labor unions, professional organizations. The paper that I showed you earlier in the Journal of the Journal of European Public Policy is about the clientelist collective system of interest intermediation. So what I observed in Greece is that, again, there are individuals who become part of this clientelistic change, but mostly this practice concerns professional organizations and labor unions. So definitely, as long as the benefit is such that it is given as a club good, so a private good for a number of people who belong to a category, that is prone to clientelism. And because it is prone to clientelism, it can be used in the fashion that I described, creating a star-shaped form of connectivity between the government, the distributing organization, the political party in control of the government, and those organizations themselves. So you're absolutely right, and thank you for allowing me to emphasize this important dimension that clientelism affects collective action, affects the pattern of collective action and the behavior of collective organizations.
All right. So let's ask Erwin the question, and myself, and then Nathaniel. So yeah.
Hi, Aris. Good to see you again. I am wondering whether this dynamic is enough to account for a real slide away from democracy. And I guess my first question was some variation on what Roger asked, and it was a little bit, isn't there too much pluralism in Western societies to see this as a real threat? And I guess my conceptual question would sort of follow from that, in the sense that, yes, you can buy off groups, but those groups are still competing with each other for the resource. So they're seeing other people being in an even cooler club. They might lobby one of the other parties to set up an even better club when they get into power. So I'm not so sure whether if you have a genuinely plural society, whether this is actually a viable strategy for governance, whether it's not far too costly. In most situations, obviously a crisis situation, right, might undo that a little bit. And so your COVID, I think, example in the previous answer was important in that respect. But isn't there more required in the sense that the state actively tries to homogenize interests or tries to align interests in very large groups, which it can really make loyal? Because otherwise you keep buying like 500,000 votes or something like that. Well, not buying votes, that was the metaphor you fought against, but you're like creating clientelistic relationships that are, I don't know, some sense too small to matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another excellent question, which I addressed in the study of both Greece, when there were two major parties that provided clientelism, and those social actors most of them could oscillate, can choose one or the other when they're dissatisfied, and that allowed the system to retain some competitiveness, but it was a limited competitiveness. You had two major parties with taking 40% of the votes each, which is unprecedented in Europe. But yet you had this diversity. You had some limited choice because you can switch loyalties from one party to the other. That's not the case in Belarus, where you only have one distributor organization. And the million-dollar question is, how do you silence dissent, dissatisfaction, grievances? You cannot satisfy, I said it earlier in my presentation, you cannot satisfy competing interests. But what you can do is create dependencies and change the way those dependent actors express their dissatisfaction. So think about that you have only one employer, there's no other employer. And then you really feel that you haven't been acknowledged, that you're let down, that you didn't get a good salary, good deal. How are you going to express those grievances if you're part of this hierarchy and there's no other way out? You have no exit. The key word is lack of exit. The expression of dissent happens in a different way. It can have to be subtle, it can be silenced and suppressed, or it can be through forms of expression that didn't break this declaration of loyalty. And that is because you anticipate that at some point you're going to get what you want, or that you're not going to be retaliated against. Because it is one thing not to get what you ask, and somebody else will get it, and another to see the flip side of clientelism, which I also mentioned in my paper, which is retaliation, which is discrimination, which is ostracization, which is not having access to state sponsorship, and on top of that, to have discrimination in the form of auditing or any form that the state can do as it's becoming more authoritarian, as it's becoming more repressive. The flip side of clientelism, reciprocation, benefit, is exclusion from these benefits. And social actors in that situation, in which there's no exit to an alternative clientelism network, let alone exit outside state sponsorship, have to stomach and adjust the expression of dissatisfaction against the authority.
All right. Clientelism is a mechanism of redistribution, right? And it could be described as such. And I think it matters, and I didn't see it in the paper, what it is that you're redistributing, or in where the wealth comes from. And that difference between Slovakia and Belarus, that to me is the difference of what it is that you're redistributing. So Belarus is the wealth flowing from the connections to Russia, right? And the privileges are based on the connection to Russia and oil or natural resources. In Slovakia, it's much more, there are many more sources of wealth, of those privileges. So I think that's sort of the source of checks and balances, right? In the US, we have many different sources of wealth, and you can see sort of attachments shifting over time, but the competition will be over the different sources of wealth versus Russia, which it's on all our minds right now, right? It's the natural resources that made Putin and allowed him to create this mechanism of control. And now that we are suppressing economic activity in Russia, we're going to make Putin stronger, probably.
Yeah, that's another excellent question. It's true that oil and resource-rich regimes have already been doing what I'm describing in the Gulf states, for instance, co-opting key elites and key groups and imposing complacency with the regime through the mechanism that I described, largely speaking. And Belarus definitely had all those perks from Russia, cheap oil, energy, and preferential access to the Russian market. Of course, China is another case, a developmental case, in which the Communist Party doesn't have resources, but it gives the licenses, okay? Not all clientelist distributions are costly in the sense that it's not just money or contracts or it can be subsidies. It can be regulatory permissions justified on who knows what grounds that can be the basis for retaliation, for discrimination as well. And the Chinese regime, while it was opening to global competition and global markets, had a very particular way of distributing those opportunities. You had to be a member of the Communist Party, and if you are a dissenter, you're gone overnight. Your whole empire is destroyed. So clientelism is not just the distribution of resources in this kind of a narrow sense of actual money subsidies, but also the distribution, the allocation of regulatory licenses and opportunities, including internal information. We're going to build a road there. Why don't you buy a plot of land next to it? Because this area is going to go up in prices through the market process. Now, the second point that you make is very important. I'm not saying that America is going down that path, because we have two major clientele rent-seeking organizations, and they are quite spread across the federal and the state level. So we have a different network structure of pluralism, which is very difficult to change into this star-shaped network that prevailed in countries that from communism, it was easy to make a transition to capitalism while retaining this star-shaped command and control structure and through clientelism and the allocation of business opportunities. I'm not here to make scenarios, but it's much more likely that as state sponsorship becomes more prevalent in the United States politics, because we are distributing more, we are making decisions based on expediency, urgency, emergency, that those networks will become dominant, yet still competing. I'm not sure whether they're going to merge, like two galaxies merging. They can be, what that makes is more intense competition because the stakes of politics are higher. But there is still the choice of flipping sides. So if you are the National Rifle Association, for instance, you cannot switch sides to the Democrats. You're not never going to lobby the Democrats. Or if you are represent the fossil fuel industry, you're less likely to be heard by Democrats on the far left. But if you are about making claims about green energy, or maybe some race claims, racialized claims for redistribution, that you have a place in the Democrat Party. And that helps the system retain a degree of competition, yet I'm not sure how truly competitive the system is if it requires you to take sides and to still build loyalties and work within those structures. But I'm not saying that America is going down this path, because if you are able to map the pluralism, the structure of pluralism as overlapping networks of connections, information connections, the media, and business relationships, you get a very complex system that is very difficult to be brought together under a single center.
Okay, all right, very good. I would like to talk more about that, but I'm gonna let Nathaniel ask his question, and maybe we'll come back to it later. So go ahead, Nathaniel. Yeah.
Thank you. This is all very interesting. So my thoughts are these: does the clientelist framework concentrate too much on the bootleggers to some neglect of the Baptists? Thinking about Bruce Yandel's Bootleggers and Baptists framework. Then also I'm wondering, is there any mechanism whereby informal networks that cannot directly engage in rent seeking discipline an increase in clientelism by withholding recognition of legitimacy for those extended institutions of the state? And along those lines, how do discourse groups with less elastic responses to opportunities to capture rents factor in? And that might help to explain some of what you're describing here, in that I think that the Democratic Party is more of a coalition of interests, and therefore may be more vulnerable to clientelism than the Republican Party, that is more similar to a discourse group.
Well, yeah, and it's another interesting question, because what I observed in my case studies is that competitiveness depends on having two rent-seeking actors, not one. So for some bizarre reason, the fact that the Republican is a rent-giving, rent-granting organization, to the extent that it is able to attract loyalties on the basis of clientelistic change, which gives you much higher returns and therefore has a higher mobilization capacity than general pledges to the population in terms of the necessary resources, campaign resources that are that process recruits. To that extent, if genuinely the Republican Party is the party of less state intervention, which it isn't, that means that in an economy where state sponsorship becomes more and more important, it might atrophy, because it will not give it will not satisfy the expectations that the state-sponsored economy generates. State sponsorship generates clientelism. It's not just clientelism that changes the structure. There are two processes at play. On the one hand, political parties prefer clientelism, and they find every opportunity to engage because that has a higher mobilization capacity. You create more loyal and stable relations, and you impose a structure of control within your own network of supporters. So there is a tendency for political parties to increase state sponsorship in the economy, but at the same time, state sponsorship creates a demand for political parties to engage in clientelism, to respond to those demands for preferential access, for political privilege, as I said earlier on. And the second thing is that a political party cannot unilaterally withdraw in a two-party system, cannot unilaterally withdraw from clientelism and impose reforms that diminish their clientelism or the range of economy that works under state sponsorship, because that will trigger defections. That will diminish its mobilization capacity because there will be dissatisfied clients, and it will send a signal that if you want to get your claims met, you should go to the other party because the shop is open there and it will welcome you. So the system in America will remain competitive, unfortunately, insofar as both parties are doing that. It might resemble Greece to some extent because state sponsorship has a tendency to increase again and again, and they found the mechanism of doing that. They can print money these days. They have even the theoretical backing, that I think that is the most realistic scenario. Did I answer your question, or you said something in the beginning that I didn't really catch, because you mentioned the Baptist and groups that are outside those networks? Which group are you referring to? Do you have an example?
Bruce Yandel has the theory of Baptists and bootleggers, whereby the bootleggers rely upon the advocacy of Baptists in order to get past legislation that generates privileges for the bootleggers. What role do Baptists have in your clientelist framework?
So the Baptists are those who rationalize particularistic claims in order to promote.
They're an expressive group that provides the mobilization that is necessary to get legislation passed in terms of capturing votes, usually, or at least social approval for the legislation.
Yeah, I mean, we can think of examples. For instance, if you're an industry that wants to get a contract to build a windmill, you may support groups that favor climate change action, for instance. And these groups are well-intentioned. Okay? They want to promote the notion of clean energy. Definitely, not all forms of mobilization are clientelistic. There are people who feel motivated to participate in politics for other reasons, and they can be useful for groups who want to access power through their own donations, their own support, or even without contacting them, to jump on their own advocacy and make those specific claims. These are all parts of, but it's not, I think, the major concern that I have, that there are groups who advocate policy changes for other reasons, and they can be approached or they can be used as convenient vehicles for special interests to gain access, because because I'm focusing on the relationship between those who are doing the rent seeking and the distributing agent. It's not always through other public causes. It is a direct relationship, because who is going to take the contract, even if those groups are successful and convince us that climate change means urgent action, detaching ourselves from fossil fuels? Who is going to get that contract will be subject to clientelistic change, and in that case, this general group is not part of the exchange. It is outside. Am I answering the question? I'm focusing on the clientelist relationship itself and the implications that it has for the nature of the political system. But ideology has a presence in my analysis, because some claims have to be presented with the view to appealing to a general audience. So protectionism is never advocated as, I want to take the subsidies and protect myself. It's always in the public interest. We need to protect American jobs. So there is a way to wrapping up, indeed, yes.
Excellent. So let's move on. So I have Roger, Jim, and Cameron. So Roger, let's go to you.
Can I go after Jim just because he hasn't said anything yet?
Okay, great. Yeah.
Thanks, Roger. I have a simple observation, and maybe you can just sort of unpack this. It seems like the way that you present, everything moves in one direction. And maybe there are factors that cause the slowing of this clientelist gravity toward consolidation. But it seems like those are temporary, transient factors, and that like all roads lead to a single star-shaped clientelist network that dominates everything. What would you say to that?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. It's not a deterministic model, but I'm describing a tendency for economic systems to become increasingly more and more state-sponsored. And I'm describing why it's becoming that, because if you have politics as a mechanism in which privilege can be distributed to particular beneficiaries, that invites those claims. That invites us to change our efforts from trying to compete outside in the market with a plan that may fail and creating a different edge, a different connection to political power, either to protect ourselves or to gain access to newly distributed resources and avoid exposure to competition. So the nature of politics as authoritative distribution of privilege of resources that can lift you up or destroy you creates this tendency, this social demand for more state, and the supply mechanism, clientelism, which is butter on the bread of politicians, but it's not deterministic as to the implications on the nature of the political system, because as I said earlier, that doesn't necessarily lead to a star-shaped structure where one political organization is at the center. It can be two parties, for instance, that are doing that. And then you have a competitive system where one party can expose the dirt of the other party. And there are episodes in which this tendency is curbed. In the case of Greece, it was for the financial crisis. But again, it is a temporary, slowdown because of this, what I call the very rational choice in the literally way. It is rational for politicians and for economic actors to seek that kind of relationship at an individual firm level. And then that has implications, networked implications that change the structure of the economy and the political landscape. And that level, I'm not deterministic. Okay? It can be two major rent-seeking organizations capturing different sides, as in the case of America, or it can be one single organization at the very center, becoming dominant, as in Hungary, for instance. There are, of course, exogenous events, especially for small states. In Greece, the party system collapsed because of the crisis. So now we have essentially one big network, clientelist network, run by the only party that survived and absorbed part of the other network. And not to my surprise, there are talks now that Greece is going down the path of Hungary, because the Syriza party didn't have the opportunity, or maybe they didn't want to, I don't know. They didn't have the opportunity to build a network, a clientelist network as strong as New Democracy. And because the socialist collapsed, the loyalties shifted to the party that kept doing this once the crisis was partly over. And we're coming back to this fiscal profligacy, direct contracts offered to preferential access offered to business people, and the clientelist system returns because it is a rational thing for political actors to do and for socioeconomic actors to pursue.
So I guess last comment, but can you envision going from one centralized system to a two-party system? How would you observe that? Because again, I see going from 2 to 1 pretty easy. And maybe that's the gravity, right? But how about from 1 to 2? We see it in history, but like theoretically, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that actually. From 2 to 1 is when there is a crisis and there is the collapse of the party in power that takes the blame for the crisis, which in case of Greece were the socialists. But from 1 to 2, I'm not sure how this is possible, because the hierarchical controls are very strict. And then not only do they create a nexus of loyalties across society, but they contain factionalism and defection from within the party. Because if you're out of the fold, you're out of the party, you're in the wilderness, okay? And no actor who is accommodated within that system, even if dissatisfied, is going to be better off by defecting and organizing collective action, making the proto-formation of a political organization or joining a very weak party in order to build something from scratch. Where the infrastructure is there, it makes more sense to wait for your own turn, to stomach, to tolerate, and try to gain access. There is competition, there is dissatisfaction within the major organization, but it's all, it is not centrifugal, and therefore it doesn't create this external competition and the level of contestability that is required for a system to be truly democratic, so that you have the political liberty to express your thoughts and preferences without fear of retaliation.
Well, yeah, Roger, I guess we should be moving on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you're right, Ars, about the this tendency to get like more star-shaped. Very worrisome. Um, Jim had this sort of vital question, right? Because we have seen it go the other way. So, there's always more work to be done. But I think you're really putting your finger on something important here. Whether clientelism is the best or sort of a sufficient theoretical framework, I feel more fuzzy on it. I know it's, of course, right? The politicians providing special benefits, and, so right on to that. Is clientelism exact? I don't know. I feel fuzzy about that. There may be a role for a sort of more integral role for ideology that even already exists in your analysis. And of course, I'm thinking of Havel. Right? You put the sign for the peas and the carrots in the window that says "Workers of the World Unite," because that's your signal. Right? So there's more or less costly signals of loyalty that are probably ought to probably likely be put into the story. But I wanted to just muse on something. I'm sorry, I apologize in advance. I don't have a coherent statement or question, but it seems to me here in the U.S. we're pretty star-shaped, right? It seems like oh, I'm sorry. I forgot a really stupid, silly, trivial point, but just in terms of exposition, I think it's worth the 30 or 90 seconds or whatever to, show stars, a couple of different versions of a small world network, show the stars shape network, which is a kind of small world network, as you know. And just to go through that, right? I mean, I don't think anybody in this group was tripped up or having difficulty, but just as a matter of exposition. But anyway, that's nothing in substance. Getting back to the substance, forgive me if I got you wrong. It just seemed like you were sort of saying like, well, it can't be all that star shape if you got the two parties. They got different clients competing for the different clients. So what's star shape? Because the unit that you see sort of at the center of the star is like a partisan political group. But we have in America and like in the modern world, call it what you will, the administrative state, the deep state, I call it the entangled deep state, the national security state, all these different lingo for this. And it was flagged way back in President Eisenhower's farewell address. I guess that must have been 61, right? So that's pretty star-shaped, and it's getting more star-shaped by the decade, and it's a product of regulation. It's a product of occupational licensing. It's a product of the revenue sharing system initiated by President Nixon way back. It's a product of grants. I just think of my own industry, American higher education. And, people, I think outsiders view the sort of left drift of American higher education as somehow just, college professors with their nerdy thoughts are like off in their own crazy direction or something like that. But no, it's all a product of, the Department of Education. It's the rate of accrediting agencies. It's the NIH and the NSF funding agencies. It's the power of the executive over things like how to interpret Title IX, and so on and so on and so on, right? So there's this huge state involvement in higher education, and that's driving this uniformity of schools and this ideological uniformity as well. And in fact, on my campus, my colleagues, many of them, will explicitly argue that free speech is bad because it's a tool of oppression, right? So that's how bad it's gotten. So what? So I think that illustrates how there's all these mechanisms to make some kind of administrative entity at the center of the star. And there's like, I feel like the Democrats and Republicans are just fighting over who's going to sit in the throne, but the throne is there. Anyway, that's not very coherent, but I'd love to hear your response to that. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very important what you're raising, because the administration, as I said, the government itself superimposes a star-shaped network because of the commands that it sends and the messages also about what is appropriate, what virtue can be signaled, the ethos of education, for instance, the messages that it promotes. But the thing is that still it is contested. You can still turn on Fox News, or you can still go to Texas. No, and these ideas are not prevalent. So yes, the problem of administration is that it becomes more and more detached from politics, that parties essentially occupy, but they don't even necessarily fully control the administrative apparatus. At least Trump couldn't control these apparatus. That's a problem of how far the independence of the administration goes. But the administration may promote a certain ethos and a certain ideology, but this promotion is still contested. So you're free to say, I don't like it, without facing any consequences. There are states that do not subscribe to what we call the dominant ideology, the dominant ethos of the federal administration, and diverge. So it's not the perfect system, but it has what I define as the characteristic of a democracy, as opposed to authoritarianism: contestability and political freedom to criticize and maybe change it. Or if you can't change, criticize the role of the administration itself. It's not that you're going to get the positive change that you want. You're never going to be satisfied by politics. Most people will never have all their visions satisfied. But you have this contestation, you have protest, you have this discussion that gives rise occasionally to Bernie Sanders, to Trump, to who knows, outsiders that articulate something that deviates from what the mainstream wants to promote.
I'll just. I still feel like you're being too optimistic, but I don't have a coherent like counter argument or something like that. So I'll just share this one datum. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, had an op-ed that was distributed in the Washington Post and a lot of other outlets, explicitly calling for regulations of harmful speech, state regulation of harmful speech. So I feel we're much closer to the precipice than your response to me seems to suggest. But again, I don't have some sort of coherent theoretical counter argument to what you were just saying.
Yeah, I just like the small tones in Roger's question, so I'm gonna build on that because I share them, and then Cameron, we'll have you ask your question. But I struggle here, right? Because of course the US is not an authoritarian state like Russia, right? So, but at the same time, what is the value of this exit option of contestability if there is no institutional diversity, right? Like in just trivial example, in higher ed, I hear my colleagues complain about politics in higher ed and all this like unhealthy dynamics and no actual focus on students, right? Like students are just this inconvenience that we need to deal with. But every institution is the same, right? So it's the same politics at every single institution. So and it goes back to the state power and then the grants that Roger mentioned, and even with the media, like the coverage now is exactly the same in every single outlet. Yes, Fox is a little different, but not really, not on major content points. So I guess, yeah, that value of exit is definitely diminished when you don't have actual diversity. And then like how do we, and I guess others asked about this too, like how do we talk about transformation over time, right? Because it's not static, right? At different points you have more or less contestability. So how do we recognize that?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that this conversation, that my presentation stirred that kind of thinking. Because if you think about it, democracy is not just a categorical concept. You're either a democracy and everything is perfect, fully contestable, you have full political liberty, or you're authoritarian. There is actually a continuum and a very nuanced continuum of how far you can go to express your dissatisfaction without facing some consequences. But my point is about going in the direction of authoritarianism. It's not about the quality of democracy contestation, that you are complaining, but you're not heard, essentially. But it is interesting, from my perspective, from my analysis, to see whether this uniformity that exists in the media, to which extent it is the result of clientelist connections and the outcome of an increasing role of the state in sponsoring activities, or whether it is just a consensus in society that, or at least among the elites, a form of Gramscian or hegemony that every society has some dominant ideas, but there's not a single center that promotes them or a single node. Okay, so I like to be a little bit more careful that even if we find ourselves in the very minority, we have a view that is not heard, is stifled. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is the result of coercion. When I mention clientelism, I mention clientelism as a form of coercion, not as a form in which different people have similar preferences and they don't like the rest. So they're not going to hire you because we are in a certain mindset. It is coercion to the extent that your dissent will find no exit, and therefore you think twice before expressing your true preferences. And then you have to grin and bear it. That is coercion. But you are right to pose a very important question for me. Do you really need to have a single node, a single agent to do that? Or how free we are when there is virtue signaling and when there is a cost to exit? But that cost is not created by an agent who wants to take democracy down an authoritarian path, but it's created by a consensus, by dominant ideas, by dominant interest as well. That's a very good question.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And Cameron, sorry for the long wait.
Yeah, no worries. So I'm gonna build on a question that I had set myself up earlier for, but didn't actually get around to asking, and that's pushing back on the immune system metaphor. Because one piece of evidence that seems to run counter to your story is the fact that the more fractionalized a country is, whether ethnically, linguistically, or whatever measure you use, the more clientelistically it will be organized. And so it very much does not seem like contestability as such is a sign of a healthy democracy or a bulwark against clientelism. In fact, it seems that polarization or fractionalization, probably the same phenomenon, would encourage clientelism by being an instigator for being able to look behind who certain policies are going to benefit, right? When you don't have the sort of common culture, then, and this connects to Marta's point, that if you don't have a common culture that you can escape to, then you're bound to a clientelist network, whether there's one clientelist network, whether there's 2 or 3 or 50, right? You can't get by without one. And so you talked about a situation where one party can expose the dirt of the other party. And that's great if you have an uncommitted mass that can switch allegiances. If you don't, then you get a situation like what you see a lot in the US today. Well, yeah, we're exposing the dirt on your party, but then everybody's going to rally behind that. And yeah, we're okay with that dirt. And so there seems to be no real accountability unless you can escape from the clientelist network. And it seems like, the contestability of a democracy seems like something almost completely orthogonal to the question of clientelism. And so I wonder about the connection there. Can we have, is there a strong connection between contestability and clientelism one way or the other, or can you have both, neither?
I'm glad you're asking this question, because the presence of fractions, ethnic fractions, religious fractions, make it even more difficult for a wannabe authoritarian or wannabe autocrat, whether that's a leader or an organization, to be able to satisfy those differences, insofar that there is animosity, of course, between those fractions and historical memories that are alive. Or that was the problem that the Assad regime, for instance, had, because he represented a minority in Syria. And Libya as well, it's another case where you have a clientelist state, quite prosperous because of the oil revenues, but yet you have those tribal politics. And the moment there is an exogenous event, the Arab Spring, and possibly some intervention, or the whole system collapses and you have different tribal groups essentially being mobilized to capture power based on loyalties that are traced to ethnic characteristics or tribal characteristics. But coming back to the advanced democracies, because my question is what happens with advanced democracies that have found a way to handle fractionalism and factionalism, both fractionalism and factionalism. This is, as I said, a difficult terrain for a political organization to capture. And this particular point brings me to the first point that Roger made, which I didn't answer satisfactorily, whether clientelism is sufficient in bringing about a slight authoritarianism as hegemony. Okay, I'm not talking about constant coup d'etats where one party comes, a military junta topples down the other. I was talking in my paper about hegemony. You have elections, you have legitimacy supposedly, and you have a leading organization on top of politics and a very weak opposition. It's not sufficient. It increases the risk. But as I said in the article that is published in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations, there is a synergy of actions that the authoritarian leader, the wannabe autocrat, should do on the level of legitimacy and ideology and model sustainability. So you need to have a claim of legitimacy, that you are somehow democratically elected, that you have the support of the public. And this is more difficult if you have ethnic animosities and conflicts. And I'm not talking about a very small minority that can be discriminated and ostracized, but a division of like 20, 30% versus 60% in that particular society. And there is a synergy through which clientelism, when it becomes the domain of a single organization, help you to portray an ideology that becomes dominant. And in the case of Belarus, for instance, it's a national identity ideology that he built, while discrediting alternative narratives of Belarus being completely distinctive from Russia. His idea was a bit of a Soviet nostalgia, was a bit of the state protecting the people from the vagaries of the market, from the uncertainties that other post-communist regimes were facing in the 90s in their painful transitions to capitalism. It is of memories of World War II, the Great Patriotic War. But the question is, why was Lukashenko was the only one who were portraying this ideology that indeed resonated with the preferences, and nobody else came to appropriate this message? Because if something is dominant, for instance, wokeism or whatever you identify as the mainstream ideology in a given society, it doesn't mean that only one political organization will monopolize it, let alone that if you govern, you're not going to be very consistent with what is required of you, given the promises and the ideological commitment that you have made. Why do you have a monopoly on what becomes the legitimizing ideology? Because you control the nodes of communication, because you're the only one visible in portraying this message and stifling not only the articulation of opposing narratives, but even your own antagonists who would like to appropriate your own message and say, I'm going to be a better nationalist than you. I'm going to be a better state socialist than you. So there's a synergy that I describe in this paper between ideology, legitimacy, and clientelism in that process, which is paved with difficulties, of course, and sustainability. In the case of Belarus, Russian subsidies, in other regimes, it can be a different form of sustainability. So the argument is more nuanced, but the emphasis is on clientelism as the catalyst, the catalytical force of clientelism in doing that. Am I answering the question, or do you want to add something about?
Sort of. I mean, my question was more about, can you have clientelism without that sort of centralization, or can you have that kind of centralization without clientelism?
Yes. Well, I answered the second question. You cannot, in my view, have that kind of centralization because of dissatisfaction, because of pluralism, because of diverse views, because of different policies that help somebody, help some people, and do not help others. So in a context of diversity, it's very likely to satisfy your electorate to that degree, to get 60% of the votes solely by public policy and the distribution of public goods and being a good governor. Even if you're the ideal person, somebody else will come and say, I can be better than you. Or anything like a catastrophe or a disaster or COVID, anything exogenous can also be used against you because voters just feel we had enough of you. Let's try something else. And of course, there are different ideologies that cannot be reconciled, right, left, more state intervention, less state intervention, that attract different people. So the answer to the second question is no. The answer to your first question, where you can have clientelism and competition, I said earlier that you can if you have multiple clientelist networks that do not merge, but they compete with one another, such as the case of Greece and possibly what is happening now in the United States between the Republicans and the Democrats, particularly if there are some rent seekers that cannot really change allegiances. They cannot abandon the Republican Party to go to the Democrats because there is an ideology on top of that. Parties should defend their ideology. They cannot change their views and say, okay, I'm pro-guns, for instance, or I'm pro state-administered system of education.
But then my question would be, you mentioned Assad. How do you explain the Arab world then? Here's some place that's extremely tribally oriented in its politics, but also you seem to have a lot of authoritarianism holding that together. And the point of the authoritarianism is to hold that together.
Yes, well, I studied a little bit Saudi Arabia and the Emirates that are examples of sustained authoritarian regimes, despite the presence of tribes. But they also had the component of clientelism, such as Gaddafi. In case of Syria, the resources were very much limited, but there is a system of loyalty based on clientelism. What they also they had is that they used those resources to build a stronger claim of legitimacy. They were more affluent than Syria, but they also built a stronger sense of legitimacy based on the ancestry, the origins that they have to Muhammad, to the traditions that they did. But they did rely on clientelism because similar regimes in Iraq, when you had this royal family, I don't remember the name now, this dynasty. That dynasty collapsed in Syria and Iraq, but survived somehow in Jordan. And the Saudi Arabia, the Saud dynasty also survived by combining, as I said, the synergy of legitimacy and clientelism quite cleverly, which in those traditional societies is all about religion, promoting religion very strongly, so that people will have this kind of a loyalty to the regime as deriving this power from God, from their own traditions.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And we are actually out of time. So thank you so much, Aris, for a very engaging paper, and thank you all for an excellent discussion. Next month we'll be meeting for a presentation by Nathaniel Goodman. So there was a small change in the schedule, and we were lucky that Nathaniel stepped in, and then we will workshop his papers. So yeah, thank you all, and thank you to our presenter.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that I could be a bit more optimistic. Usually whenever I talk, it's all about dark, everything is going dark and bad, but that's my role. If you want something more optimism, I have my friend Nikawa next to me, and you can talk about neoliberal social justice next time. But I'm the pessimist guy. So.
Yeah.
But we're both colleagues in the University of Lincoln. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your very helpful and insightful comments.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was awesome stuff.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
And also, hello, Nick.
Hello.